When I think of the word hood, I think of a person, a place, and perhaps even a thing. I'm Sir Creepsta, and welcome to Muhlenberg County Ghost Stories from the Hood. Tonight's tale of terror is entitled Panzella, the Friendly Ghost. In the past, I've shared stories with you from several of my family members and friends involving sightings of ghostly shapes and apparitions, each one telling me just how terrified they were behind the sightings. Tonight's tale of terror once again involves a ghost. Only this time, it's a ghostly story about one that I myself deem friendly, based on the type of haunting that I personally experienced firsthand. So, sit back, relax, grab some snacks, and be terrified by yet another Muhlenberg County ghost story from the hood. The timeline of this particular story that I'm about to share with you was somewhere around September of the year 2002. It was around that time that my beloved grandmother, Mrs. Panzella Salisbury, had sadly passed away 1 month earlier, around the middle of August. The sudden death of my grandmother shook the family like a California earthquake. Granny was well loved by our entire family, and her death hit everyone extremely hard, especially her beloved husband, Mr. Arthur Lewis Salisbury. So hard, in fact, that Granny could no longer live in the apartment there alone. So, with the help of myself and other family members, he moved in with his daughter, who happened to be my mom, Mrs. Marie Martin. Having left nearly everything in his home when he moved in with Mama, Granddaddy came to me a few days later and asked me if I wouldn't mind moving into their apartment just to keep it occupied until he thought that he might be able to move back in, and to also watch over all of his and Granny's belongings. If you knew my grandfather and the type of kind-hearted, loving man that he was, then you would know that there was no way that I could possibly tell my grandfather no. So, in that same month, I moved out of the home I was renting, which was on a month-to-month lease, and moved into my grandparents' apartment. Within my first week of being in my grandparents' apartment, I felt a strange aura in the air. It was like I wasn't there alone. Bear in mind, I'm not one to be frightened easily, so I just shook it off as being the feeling that one would have when they moved into a new place. But as time went on, I would start to hear the sounds of Granny's dishes and glassware rattling throughout the night whenever I'd be lying in the bed asleep. This didn't bother me too much at first. I just thought that perhaps it was the apartment building's foundation settling in, or something of that nature. But what was strange about the dishes rattling was that whenever I would get up out of bed to go into the kitchen to check it out, the rattling would immediately stop. After about 2 months or so of the events happening in the kitchen continued to happen, only by now it was happening whenever it was daylight as well. At that point, I began to think that maybe there was more to it than just the ground settling in. I just didn't know what it could be. The thought of the home being haunted hadn't entered my mind just yet, but I knew for a fact that something wasn't right with what was happening in Granny's kitchen. It wasn't until one night when I was sitting in the living room listening to some music while I was studying for the test I had the next morning at the local community college that I knew something was definitely going on in my grandparents' home. While sitting there studying, I thought for a brief second that I saw a shadow come from my grandparents' room and go into the bathroom, which was right across the hallway. I sit there for a second, then I got up and turned on the lights down the hallway of the respective two rooms. I slowly walked down the hall, looked over into my grandparents' room, then into the bathroom, and I saw nothing. But as I stood there, just processing in my head what had just occurred, I faintly started to smell the fragrance of perfume, one that I recognized right away, because it was one that my grandmother always wore whenever I would go up to give her a hug or a kiss on her cheeks. I won't lie, chills immediately ran up and down my body, for I knew for a fact that Granny's presence was definitely in the home. Knowing that my grandmother was still around didn't bother me at all, for I knew deep down inside that Granny loved her firstborn grandchild with all of her heart, and she would have never done anything to hurt me. After that night, things began to make more sense to me, especially when it came to the rattling of the dishes in the kitchen. Granny was never satisfied with where grandfather would put away the dishes in the cupboard, and after he washed them, So she would always go behind Granddaddy and rearrange the dishes in her liking, making them rattle loudly together while she placed them in the different areas of the cupboard. This always made me laugh because Granddaddy would be so fierce to Granny afterwards, telling her that she should have gotten up and washed them herself. Then she could place them wherever she wanted to place them. But nonetheless, after spending many years together, they loved each other immensely. So much so that Granny passed away only 2 months after Granny did. At that time, I didn't have a lot of visitors dropping in to see me, which was perfectly fine with me. It allowed me to have more time to study for my upcoming quizzes and tests at community college. Up to this point, I had only mentioned what was going on in the apartment to a handful of people, my brother and sister being 2 of them. And they too felt that after teasing me for about being scared, it was just Granny messing around with me, hanging around before she crossed over. This all changed in the coming months. One day while I was sitting in the living room watching some television, a friend of mine who went by the nickname Rut dropped by to pay me for a friendly visit. I told him to have a seat on the sofa, which faced the hallway that led to the bathroom, and he did. About 10 minutes into his visit, I heard the dishes in the kitchen start to rattle. At first, I wasn't sure that Rut had heard them, so I just played it off and continued on with my conversation. It wasn't until he looked at me and asked if anyone else was here with me when I realized that he in fact had heard the sounds too. I calmly looked over at him, telling him no it isn't. The only people in the apartment was he and I. Then I asked him, out of curiosity, why he thought that there was someone there. He immediately answered back, saying that he thought he heard someone rattling some plates in the kitchen. I looked at him and laughed, telling him that he must be hearing things, all along knowing that it was dear old Granny just having some fun. Some ghostly fun at that. The answer I gave must have made him feel at ease, as he too leaned back on the couch and started talking about what he had been up to. Then immediately out of nowhere, Rut jumped up off the couch and told me that I was lying about no one else being there with us, because he had just seen somebody go across the hallway and into the bathroom. I looked at him and told him that he must be seeing things, and that I would prove it to him that no one else was there but the 2 of us. I got up and turned on the hallway lights. Then I walked down the hallway and went straight into the bathroom with him on my heels right behind me. I turned around and looked at him with a smirky grin on my face, saying to him, I told you that ain't no one here but the 2 of us. I could tell that by the look on his face he wasn't buying the answer I gave him for nothing. And he turned and walked back down the hallway, grabbed his keys, and said he would get up with me on a later time as he rushed out our front door. Rupp would never return to my granny's house the remainder of the time that I lived there, telling me later on when I ran into him in the hood that what he saw scared him to death that night. As time went by, I would have a couple of other friends of mine come by and experience the exact same thing that Rudd had, only to never return to the apartment again. I would continue to hear the dishes and the rattling in the kitchen, and I would periodically see the shadow figure crossing the hallway, only to go on to the bathroom and smell the sweet fragrance of my granny's perfume, which was fine with me. It wasn't until I was awakened one morning out of my sleep from a dream I was having about Granny when I looked down on my t-shirt and saw what appeared to be a spider slowly crawling up towards my face, that I knew for sure that Granny's presence was around me at all times. I'm sure that I was waiting for a moment to jump up and knock off the spider onto the floor. I ran into the kitchen, grabbed an empty jar with a lid on it, and then I went back into the bedroom, located the spider, and put it in the jar. I took the spider to my father, who worked for the housing authorities at the time. He took it to his boss to try to identify the spider. It turned out that the species of this spider that nearly had bitten me was none other than the venomous brown recluse. Having already experienced the bite of a brown recluse around 1996, I knew what I had to do to get out of the projects fast and find me another place to live, and that's exactly what I did. Soon after my experience with the recluse, my father would tell my mom and me that they had to get exterminators to spray into all the apartments because they had a brown recluse infestation with many apartment buildings there. But thanks to my loving granny, I was spared a second bite, and for that I will forever be grateful to her. So, to anyone who happens to know someone that lives at 415 South 9th Street, and they happen to mention strange things going on in the kitchen with the dishes and periodically seeing a shadow figure, quickly followed up by the smell of sweet perfume. Let them know exactly everything will be just fine, because it's only Grandma Panzella, the friendly ghost, still hanging around in her old house, having a little bit of ghostly fun. I'm Sir Creepsta. Until next time, stay terrified.